empirical science is going to be the way to answer these questions because of the history of it. And it's showing us that over time and again, we have been able to operationalize something we thought was unoperationalizable and make progress empirically in a way that wasn't available to us before. So then if you say, well, how can we do that? Then all I can give you are past examples, because by definition, obviously, we're thinking of some way we haven't thought of yet. We've seen over and over in the history of science this happen. And so I think it's reasonable to think that will happen in the case of consciousness as well.
Welcome everyone to today's AMA, where we are pleased to have Dr. Richard Brown. He received his PhD from the City University of New York and is now a professor of philosophy there. And his primary interests are in philosophy of mind, although he has more general philosophical interests as well. And if you'd like to introduce some of your other projects, including your YouTube channel and other things you've written on, feel free to do so. But welcome, Richard Brown.
Thanks. Yeah, I appreciate it. Nice to be here. Yeah, I have a YouTube channel where I host discussions about consciousness and philosophy and neuroscience of consciousness. So people may be interested in that. But other than that, yeah, that's about it. It's on my website. Consciousness Live is what it's called.
Great. So we'll include those some of those links in the server here and also on the video when it gets uploaded. So cool. I think to start out, maybe if we could get in a sort of a brief account of your approach or general view in the philosophy of mind, and then we'll go on from there.
Okay. Well, my overall position is somewhat agnostic, since I think these questions are very difficult. And when I started, I had much more firm convictions, but as I've gone through, I feel somewhat like a lot of these questions we just don't know the answers to. But I sort of still have my overall sympathies lie with some kind of physicalism, and I've defended higher order theories of consciousness, and I guess my firmest conviction is something like the identity theory, mind-brain identity. But even there, I'm not a full on convert, but I do think that it's defensible position, and that's about it. So I guess but also coupled with all that, I'm a kind of a big believer in the reality of phenomenal consciousness, and so I would deny views like illusionism and those sorts of things. So I want a kind of a physicalism that accounts for the sort of manifest reality of consciousness, which some people find difficult or hard to understand. And so like I said, I wouldn't say that I know that is true, but I certainly would like it to be true. I don't think it's been refuted.
Fair enough. Why would you like it to be true? Is there some motivations or intuitions in its favor, would you say, or?
Yeah, so I think the biggest one is the causal relevance of the mental to the physical. So if you look at the kind of historical picture, or at least like a potted history of the historical picture, one that you hear lots, like you start with Descartes, and Descartes has this mind-body dualism, and there's the question of how the two interact, the mind and the physical. And Descartes didn't have a really good answer because, well, part of the issue was the background picture about the way the physical world worked, a very Newtonian picture where transmitting causes to effect requires some kind of contact between the two, and so it wasn't clear how this non-physical thing could come into causal contact with the physical world. That's I guess is attributed to Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, who wrote to him on this objection, and he doesn't have a really good answer to that. And so I think you'd put that same objection slightly differently given the way physics has progressed. But it's still an issue, I think, about this causal interaction. And so for me personally, anyway, that was like psychologically the biggest factor in my sort of coming to realize that my sympathies really were on the physicalist side. The thing about cause and effect, like, how is it that these these mental occurrences, like a seeing and hearing something, can cause me to respond in a certain way. So I just couldn't take epiphenomenalism, and I didn't understand how things could interact from a dualist perspective. So I think that's probably the biggest reason.
Fair enough. Yeah, I mean, we no longer think that conscious stuff is reaching into the physical world via the pineal gland or by some other part of our brain or so on.
Yeah, but even so, there are still like substance dualists, like that there still are people out there who think that the mind is a kind of non-physical substance. I think Swinburne, maybe someone like that, Richard Swinburne, but there are others too. And if you really, I think about like the link between the physical world and the mental world, we don't really understand what cause and effect is at a real deep. I mean, it's still a philosophical question about what the nature of causation is, and so there are different models that you could have about how this non-physical thing could interact with the physical world. But I think that overall, what gives me skepticism about that picture is that as we study the brain, we don't find any unexplained causal events. So it's never the case, or hasn't been yet at least, that we see some sort of neural activity like neurons firing action potentials or a chemical exchange at a synapse or whatever. And then we can't trace the causal chain back to some physical event which preceded it, or to the environment that the animal is in. So there hasn't, as of yet, been a kind of like neural activity where we go, oh, this would require to explain how it occurred would require postulating some energy source that was outside of the normal physical interactions. And we haven't really seen that. Now, that really depends on the brain being a kind of closed system causally, and it's not clear that it is because it's so complex system. So I think there's wiggle room on both ends of that. But that just seems like a piece of evidence right there that we haven't. There hasn't been a need to postulate the existence of an outside cause. I mean, a non-physical cause. And so then, if that continues, then if consciousness is real, it would have to be epiphenomenal if all the cause and effects are taken care of at the physical level. Which is why, if you think that the mind is the physical, so if they're just identified, then you get the causal power. Why is it that this conscious state has the cause and effects that it does? Well, because it's just a physical state. So I still think, in my thinking, that's one of the biggest reasons for taking physicalism seriously. And it's been quite some progress in philosophy, I would say, that the kind of panpsychism that's out. Well, I'm not a panpsychist, but at least they've made an attempt to try to address this question from like a panpsychist point of view about how, if the physical properties really just are consciousness in and of themselves, there's an identity at that level, then whatever cause and effect powers the physical properties have is just the cause and effect powers of the bits of consciousness. So at least I think there's been some effort amongst the people who find troubles with physicalism to try to understand this cause and effect issue, and to account for it in their theorizing, rather than just like defending epiphenomenalism, which I mean is something that you can do, but it's a lot less popular nowadays.
Do you think that this sort of reasoning could be made even without appeal to causation? Like, for example, suppose we just consider that, well, how the physical world evolves, including how the outcomes of our actions occur, depends in a way only on the prior physical states and like the laws of nature, maybe some objective chanciness if there is any. And so it doesn't seem that something else is making a difference in the world, even if we don't construe that like causally. Do you think something like that could be a reasonable approach?
Yeah. So I mean, I'm not. So can you just say that? Can I ask you just to rephrase that? So or let me see if I can rephrase it and see if I'm understanding what you're saying. So is the idea that you don't talk about like an event causing another event, but you just say there's a progression or something like that that's not causal?
Yeah, I mean the world evolves in a certain way, and part of what occurs is going to be the outcomes of our actions, like the things that follow mental events and so on.
Right.
But there's no need in describing how it's going to evolve to appeal to some non-physical thing, right? It's just given some state of affairs and the laws of nature and maybe some objective chanciness, if there is any, you can explain all the results in principle, at least. And so you don't need to appeal to some non-physical, mental interaction or something else like that.
Yeah. Oh, I see. I think I was misunderstanding. So I think here it may be that there's a distinction you want to make about like the word physicalism and what it applies to. So you can have, like, the way I was thinking about it was that I'm a physicalist about the mind.
Right.
It's a separate and further claim to say, well, you're physicalist about everything, about the nature of the entire realm. And so some people would say, look, there's got to be some non-physical things, generally speaking, like maybe numbers, logical truths. I don't know. So,
oh yeah,
but
I'm not trying to make a state or take a position on that.
Okay.
But at least as it concerns the things, relevant to our actions and so forth, the evolution of the physical stuff in the room, so to speak, where we exist, that sort of thing, those sort of things can be described physically, and the outcomes can be predicted in that sort of way without appeal to non-physical interaction, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And so I mean, I'm perfectly happy with that way of putting it. So yeah, I think that is a good way to start then, given what you just said.
All right, fair enough.
But I mean, so that would be the idea. There would be that, well, we just have some reason to believe that everything is physical. So I think that the question would still come up, because I think many people who think of the mind as not physical think of this as being maybe the one special area, and everything else is going to be law-like and regular. And then there's this new thing, which only has to do with the nature of the mind. And so I think that if you sort of appeal to general physics, as you were just saying, not even physics, but just some evolution of things, which I would have a hard time understanding without invoking causal relations, unless what you're meaning is something just like, well, we have mathematics that describes it, and there, so maybe nothing causal is involved in that. But so many people can accept that, but then they're going to say, look, the mind is somehow unique or special. And so what I was suggesting was that even here, it looks like there's just no irregularities that are going to need to be explained. So I think you're right, though. That's like a special instance of the more general thing that you were saying, if I'm understanding you right. But I still think that there's a room for someone to respond and say, well, look, that other stuff is one thing, but here's something that's unique. And the way I was putting it sort of puts pressure on that.
All right, sounds good. Yeah, you mentioned in one of your first replies that you've worked on higher order theories of consciousness.
Yeah.
You've written or co-written several articles, especially recently on that matter. Do you mind briefly laying out what higher order theories are and contrasting them with, say, first order theories and so on?
Yeah, no problem. So when the word higher order is the way it's used there, what it means is, what it's referring to is a kind of a mental state which has as its content another mental state. So you have you can usually think about perception as the first way to get into this idea. So we can perceive the external environment. Like I see there's books on my desk and there's a cup of tea sitting next to me. But it also seems like, at least when you start thinking about this, that maybe you can perceive the contents of your own mind. And some people in the history of philosophy have gone so far as to say, well, this is clearly the case. Aristotle famously said, when I see, I also perceive that I see. So there's a kind of reflexivity to the kind of conscious experience that we're talking about. There's not only an awareness of the external environment, but somehow an awareness of the fact that you have that first order awareness. So to back up, the first order awareness there is something which represents the external environment, where that can include the body, like your arm or leg or whatever. And then there's a kind of inner sense or inner awareness, whereby you can come to have a kind of awareness of your own mental life. So higher order theories, and people typically agree that there are these two things, right? That have like, states, which I think, which direct me towards the outside world. But then that can have states that are very introspective and direct me towards the inside world as well. And the higher order theory says, well, look, there's a kind of inner awareness, of your own mental life, which is a necessary component or part of the ordinary conscious experience that you typically have, like when you hear sounds or see colors or taste or whatever. And first order theories deny that any kind of extra higher order awareness is required. And they'll typically say all you need is like an awareness of the external environment. And then they'll have to add some conditions on to sort of deal with some puzzling cases that come up, like subliminal processing and perception and so forth. But then they'll have to add something to it. But the basic idea is that a first order or a state which is putting you in contact with the external environment is all there is to having a conscious experience. And the higher order view says, well, you need that maybe, and then also in addition, an awareness of the fact that that's occurring.
Great. So I had sort of a follow-up question about that, but it's also applicable to sort of the philosophy of mind in general.
Okay.
So even assuming that the mind is physical, how do we determine which features are constitutive of consciousness versus which are like merely strongly correlated with it? And perhaps they stand in some sort of causal relation to it. So for example, suppose that whenever we are in fact conscious, we have some higher order representation of our states, but that this representation isn't part of the mental state. It's just something correlated with it. How do we, go about ruling something like that out?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's in fact one of the big questions that exists right now, and it's closely associated. I think maybe Ned Block is someone who is an early, at least in the current contemporary perspective, an early person who's sort of pressing this kind of issue. So Ned is a professor at NYU, and he used to be at MIT before that, and he's made a lot of contributions to the philosophy of mind, and probably is a well-known person. I don't know actually if you've read any of his stuff, but I'm assuming you have. And so he first started pressing this puzzle under what he called the methodological puzzle, and the methodological puzzle was exactly the question that you just raised. And so a lot of times when we're having a conscious experience, for example, we can also report that we're having that experience. We can say, oh, I'm seeing the red triangle or tasting this taste. And so there's a question that's going to be something that's highly correlated with the occurrence of conscious experience, so that there's this ability to report. And so if you find this activity in the brain, which corresponds to what you think of as high level cognitive processes, then there's always going to be this question, what you just raised, about how can we tell that's really part of what we'll call like the neural correlative consciousness, where that's the minimal brain activity responsible for having a kind of experience. How can we tell that this is one versus the other? And so some people think that you can't empirically solve that problem. And for sort of obvious reasons that anytime you say you're going to have the experience, is a time that we're going to know about you having the experience, because that's the only way that we have to assess. So these people would say, that's the only way we have to assess whether you have the experience or not, is to ask you. That's the only way we can do science. And so if we can't ever tell the difference between you actually having the experience and you just having the state by which you report the experience, then we're going to have this confound, which is eternally there. So Ned Block famously argued that what we want to do is kind of triangulate in on the question, and that we're not going to have a direct sort of answer to the question, but rather we have to look at the kind of broadest swath of possible evidence, and that comes in from multiple layers. So we want to look at the evidence that comes in from psychology, the evidence that comes in from neuroscience, and also philosophy to some extent. And we want to see how those kind of things all hang together, and in terms of different theories, and make sense of kind of connections between them. So we want to look for ways of saying, well, here's a bunch of information about how the brain works, and here's a bunch of information about at the psychological level, at psychophysics or something like that. And then we want to see how they overlap each other. That's what he called the mesh. between psychology and neuroscience. And so what you get is a kind of argument to the best explanation. And so I think that that's really our the only way we have to really move forward in these kinds of issues. So what we have to do is look at which theory preserves overall the most of the way we common sense and theoretically think about the way the mind and consciousness relate.
Great, thanks for that answer. So I'm going to go to some text questions that we have. And by the way, anyone who's listening, if you want to ask a question in text or in VC, just look at the AMA discussion channel and post in there. So we had a question from Hedrit L. We'll get to David Lee Roth in a second, who was wondering, where is the border between consciousness and subconsciousness? Will this border fluctuate or behave in a way that allows transportation of thoughts, emotions to travel one or both ways?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it depends on what you mean by subconscious. So maybe if I'm allowed to ask follow-ups, I might ask what was meant by the subconscious. So because if it's associated with some kind of Freudian thing, I think that may be slightly different. But certainly in the contemporary like cognitive sciences, the kind of general picture, which is disputed by some people, but the general kind of picture that I would endorse is that we have subpersonal states, like states of like the brainstem and so forth, which we can never become aware of. And no matter how hard I try, I can never sort of get in touch with what's happening in my cerebellum or my brainstem. So those are just completely non-conscious processes that aren't even candidates for like entering into your experience. And then we have what would typically be called unconscious, um, but uh, but some people will call those states non-conscious because the terminology here is a mess. But we'll have states which you're not consciously having, but you could come to have. And so one typical example is like a belief that you have, a standing belief, like your birthday. So
Right.
maybe you weren't thinking about what day your birthday is on, but now that I said that, you're thinking, oh, it's on this day. So those things would be sometimes people call them pre-conscious. I don't know, whatever. So that's one way of something being unconscious, but not conscious. But there's another way of it being unconscious, because like a standing belief is probably like a disposition to have a belief as opposed to being some actual occurrent mental state. But there could be actual occurrent mental states which themselves are unconscious. And so here, like the case of subliminal priming is probably one great example where you can present something on the screen and people will say they don't see it, but then you can show it has some effect on their behavior. Like they're disposed to answer a question about a word in a certain way as opposed to another way, like the meaning of the word, for example. Like if you hear the word morning, you could interpret it as like good morning, it's morning time, or morning like you're being sad. And so people will interpret the word one way versus another if they're presented with like a sad picture, but subliminally. So they say they don't see the picture, but then afterwards you tell them, you ask them the word morning, and then they say like the one having to do with sad as opposed to the one like AM. So you're showing, and there's many examples like that where you can show that the thing was not perceived consciously, or at least the subject says they don't see it, and yet it has some effect on their behavior. So if that's what you mean by like subconscious, um, then the answer is that for each person it's slightly different, and we can test in the lab at what point they get 50% of like asking quite like you go to the ear doctor, right? And they just say, here's a tone, could you hear it or not? And then they find out where the threshold is, where you're a chance basically of saying 50% of the time yes, 50% of the time not. So but I'm not sure if I'm even answering the question, because if it meant something deeper about subconscious, then I'm not sure that
Well,
I'm
I think
saying
so.
anything addresses that.
If the idea is that whether it's conscious versus subconscious, or at least conscious versus not conscious, is whether it's something about which the person is aware, I think that probably is helpful in answering his question. It does seem to lead to, well, there's going to be a lot of vagueness, I think, right, in what counts as subconscious or non-conscious mental processing or events. Is that right?
Uh, so I'm not sure if you're asking me that question, but
Yeah.
I'm not sure what you mean by vagueness. So
Well, in that there's when talking about non-conscious processes, like you were mentioning things like that are occurring more towards the brainstem or whatever else, and things that are not candidates for entering into consciousness.
Yeah.
For discerning things that are non-conscious but otherwise, neural or mental in some way, from things that are not even mental at all, or neural at all, there's going to be a lot of borderline cases, right? Or at least not going to be clear which way they would be classified as. Or is it not really
Yeah,
a
so
relevant
you
question?
have some like occurrence that's going on in the brain, and you're saying that maybe this particular pattern of neural activity or whatever, it's not clear whether it's a subpersonal state that is not going to be one that can be conscious versus a personal level state that is a candidate for being conscious. That's what you're saying?
Sure. Or at least, or even ones that aren't, differentiating ones that aren't candidates from being conscious, but we still consider them part of like mental processing and so on, and ones that aren't even relevant to like mental processing, that aren't conscious. Like maybe, I don't know, suppose you had some cancer cells replicating in your brain. Well, that's not even the sort of thing that's we would call cognitive processing at all. Not only that it
Right.
wouldn't enter into consciousness, but it's not even relevant to it.
And you're saying that there could be cases that are vague as between those things?
Sure. I mean, it seems at least plausible, given that we don't have, at least I'm not aware of any precise criteria for counting as, for something to count as relevant to cognition and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's generally right. We, at least for the human brain, we don't have any clue really about how to answer a question like that, I guess I'd say. So, if we look at some activity that we think is important for, let's say, color, like in a certain particular part of the brain, like V5, or where there's thought to be color processing, we can say, well, on an fMRI scan, this area is differentially activated. That means there's something going on here when you're processing color, and we can show that it's activated less when the color is not subjectively perceived. Like when you say you don't see it, but it was presented subliminally, we can show that it's activated more when the thing is right there in front of your face. But we don't really know like what activity is doing, such that it results in those differences. So when we look at like brain decoding and such like that, what we're doing is actually training machine learning algorithms to decode these patterns of blood flow that we're picking up on. But we don't have like a overarching theory of the brain, or even how psychological states are realized in the brain. Although we have bits and pieces of it that I think that we could defend, so that we think that, from the basic idea that neurons are preferentially responsive to things in the environment. And you can build up from systems of those things, systems which are preferentially responsive to higher level features. And that seems to be the way brain is organized, in this kind of hierarchical way. So there's areas in the brain that are sensitive to whether there's something that's a face or not a face. And there's, like in high level, like the fusiform face area, in the temporal lobe of the brain. And then there are areas lower down that don't care about whether something is a face or not, but they care about whether there's a certain line of kind of orientation. So they seem to be preferentially sensitive in that way to things in the environment. And then the idea is that they fire together to signify the conjointness of those things. So they fire in temporal harmony, synchrony. And then that kind of information can be sent around to various subsystems on other waveforms, like theta waveforms, which can act as broadcast waveforms. So there's bits and pieces, and of course these are all theoretical things, but that's the way that science proceeds. We have an object there that behaves in a certain way, and we are trying to reverse engineer it. And it also does a bunch of psychological things. So we're not just trying to find out like mechanically how the brain functions. I mean, we are trying to do that, but we're also, in addition, at least at the level of the cognitive neurosciences, trying to figure out how a machine like that could implement certain cognitive functions. And that's very difficult. And there's one recent kind of sad demonstration that we may be on the total wrong track here. And so some people took it was an old video game or something like that, some cognitive neurosciences, like an Atari cartridge. I should have looked up the details, but they tried to use the techniques of neuroscience basically to reverse engineer it. And, so what do they do? They did lesions and they did scans of the electrical and they pinged it in various ways. And they could never really reverse engineer what program it was running, even though, this is a program that we wrote and they knew exactly what the program was. It was implementing some, like 1980s video game. But they couldn't, using the techniques of modern neuroscience, they weren't really able to reverse engineer that. And so some people have thought, we're not doing such a great job at figuring out how to implement these things. And the best we can do really right now is to say, well, this kind of activity is present when someone's performing this task, and try to correlate that with the cases where a subject says, I see the thing or I don't see the thing. So that's called the contrastive analysis. So you have the person saying, I see it, and the person saying, I don't see it. And then you look at the brain data. And then, of course, you run right back into that question, which you asked about earlier, which is, okay, so how do you tell from that the difference between the part of the brains that are involved in them saying, I see it, versus them actually having the visual experience? And so one of the things, I mean, this is now getting off on sort of a tangent here, but if you want just to continue it, one of the things we're trying to test for right now is whether people can have what's called change blindness, which is where you show them something and right afterwards a blank screen, and then you show them something else, like usually some squares that are oriented in various ways, like being up and down or horizontal or slightly at a diagonal. And they're presented in an array, like a clock face, let's say, where one is at 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. And then one of those will have changed or not. And what they're asked is, did they notice, a rectangle in this position, like the 2 o'clock position, where they noticed that it changed in orientations? And people are very bad at doing that unless you give them a cue in between. So you show them the first set of blocks and then you take it away, but on the screen, put an arrow pointing to one of the positions, like the 2 o'clock position. And then you show them the new set of blocks and they're able to say, oh yeah, okay, that one, it did or didn't change, to get much better. And so this has been a way that some people have argued, the kind of conscious experience that we have goes beyond what we can report at any given moment, and overflows, or that's the technical kind of word that Ned Block came up with, but it overflows our ability to report. And so this is one area where people have argued, what this suggests is that reportability isn't really relevant, because you can show cases where there were experiences that people had but weren't reportable. Now that's a disputed claim, and in fact I've spent some time arguing that there's another interpretation there, but that would be one of the ways that people would offer for how we might be able to get around some of these issues.
Great, that's all very interesting stuff. Of course, this research is largely human-centric, and on that, Hedrick had a sort of related question. Is consciousness only a human trait, or is it shared by other or all animals? And how do we go about determining which other species are conscious and to what extent?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think that it's first of all, I would want to separate the kind of moral question from the scientific question. And I would say that it's probably, we don't want to hang the one on the other, because we want to recognize that the moral question is its own question. I'm not sure if answering the scientific question would answer that question or not, but the moral question is like, how should we treat animals? And I think, I'm a vegan for ethical reasons, and I think that we have treated animals very poorly, and I'm very much against like factory farming and so forth. And I would, if anyone wants to ask about those kinds of views as well, I'm more than happy to talk about them. But so I think that the first thing about animals is, yes, I think that animal consciousness is widespread. At least, I mean, I think it's kind of goes beyond obvious to say that it's present in mammals. And some birds, probably, how far does it go down? Is a bee conscious? I don't know. So there, I think that it gets a little bit iffy, and you're going to have people with differing intuitions. about whether bees are conscious. They certainly can do amazing things. And in one sense of conscious, they're perfectly conscious, because if you mean, well, they're responsive to their environment, then of course they're conscious. If you mean, do they have sleep-wake cycles, then yes, of course they're conscious. The bees sleep. And I was actually just seeing some very cute pictures of bees online, huddled up inside of a flower on Twitter earlier today. So they do, they are sensitive to the environment, and they do have sleep-wake cycles, so they're conscious. But do they have experiences? That's the sense of consciousness that baffles philosophers. Do they experience the world? There, I think it's hard to know what the answer is. I've seen arguments on both sides, and I was just at a conference not too long ago at NYU on this very topic, and there are people who argue it extends all the way down through bees, and people say no. And so I think that it's very unsure. But at that point, what I would say is that's where the moral considerations come in, because if it's even probable that bees are conscious, then I think that guarantees that we ought to treat them in certain ways, just to err on the sort of side of caution, as it were. So even if we don't scientifically know the answer to the question, I think that when it comes to making like horrendous mistakes, we should be cautious. And if they were conscious, and if being conscious really mattered to morality, as many people think, so like creating more suffering overall is a bad thing. And if in our actions we are unwittingly creating like tremendous amount of suffering, so maybe each individual bee doesn't suffer too much, but like the overall suffering of bees generally may be quite astronomical, especially given the number of insects and so forth. Then I think that's something we should take seriously, as a possibility, that these things are suffering, even if minutely. And so that's going to say we should worry about them. Now, I don't think that's these questions about like, oh, so if so, then how many ants outweigh the life of a human? I think those kinds of questions are very counterproductive, and there may be vagueness there, to bring up a sort of point you were pressing earlier, like borderline cases where you're like, I don't know. But anyway, so I guess I'm getting a little bit distracted. Sorry.
No, that's great. Do you think that part of how we would go about answering that question is, well, first determining what sort of account of consciousness is correct, at least in our sake, right? So, is some higher order theory correct? And if so, maybe we would go about determining what other things are conscious by determining which other things have higher order representations of their own states, or representations and so forth. Is that sort of a way to go?
Yeah. So I think so. That was kind of where when I was getting sidetracked a second ago, that was kind of one of the points that I was trying to make in passing, was that I think the question about animals is really a moral question. And then there obviously is a scientific question about, okay, so do they instantiate this or that property there? But I just don't think that any theory of consciousness is going to outweigh those kinds of moral considerations when it comes to thinking about animals. So, and in particular, just to illustrate this, maybe when you think about like the higher order theory of consciousness, okay, so what is it? What does it say? It says you have to have this kind of inner awareness to count as being conscious. Okay, so that's a psychological fact. So how does that get implemented in the brain? Well, of course, it's not clear. So some people are going to say, well, okay, so this sounds like a kind of cognitive thing, and the frontal cortex does a lot of cognitive stuff, so probably it's going to be there. But other people say, no, it sounds like a self-consciousness thing. So there are different parts of the brain that deal with self-consciousness. So maybe it's going to be there. And then there are other people who say, well, no, wait a minute. It could be a kind of self-reflective consciousness, where the state itself is an awareness of itself, and so only involves like activity in the visual areas of the brain, the lower areas of the brain. And so because we're not really at a time in history where we can say what the brain does and how it's doing, it's really unclear how to relate these kinds of psychological level processes to the neurological level. Now, that doesn't mean that we're not going to be able to do it eventually, and it doesn't mean that we can't have evidence one way or another about things as they currently stand. But it does mean that these questions become really difficult when you try to say, okay, so what really is required, for example, empirically, for a higher order theory of consciousness to be true, you have to make some background assumptions. And so one assumption currently is that like the prefrontal cortex is importantly involved. No, notice there's nothing in the higher order theory that says, oh, it's got to be prefrontal cortex, but you might think, well, we think that's where, planning and things like that, certainly attention and those other processes, which seem to be on the same area level, are implemented there, or at least, or importantly, those areas are involved in it, like working memory and so forth. So you might think, well, for that reason, it's reasonable to think the frontal cortex is involved, and then you get a version of your question, which would be like, okay, so could we then look for whether other animals have prefrontal cortices, and we can say like bees don't, and so forth and so on. So I think that is one possible way that you could argue, and certainly what we need is some sort of theory ultimately, in order to answer questions like that in a definitive way. But there's also a problem with that, which is that we can't rule out the fact that consciousness or mentality generally is what we call multiply realized, which means that there might be different ways of implementing the same sort of like different materials from which the same thing could be built. So some people think, well, could a computer be conscious just like us? And some people say yes, whether they're physicalists. And some people who are non-physical say yes. So like David Chalmers is some sort of dualist, but he thinks computers can have conscious experience just like us. In fact, just because he thinks that there's some kind of law-like connection between the functional states of the computer and these non-physical consciousness properties, whatever they may be. And then there you go. So yeah, it's I think that question becomes very difficult once you start realizing how much variability there may be. And I just think that it's more certain that animals are conscious than any theory is going to. I don't think any theory is going to convince us that animals are unconscious. But so there are some people though who think this matters a lot. So one of these guys is named Peter Carruthers, and he defends a version of the global workspace theory of consciousness, where a state is conscious when it's sort of made available to a large variety of systems in the brain, for control of action and reports and those sorts of things. And so it's got to be globally available. And then, so that's one claim, is that, well, that's like a plausible empirical claim about what the nature of consciousness is. And the second claim is that it's not clear to what extent, there will be cases that are vague where it's not clear whether the animal really has a global workspace in this way, or whether it sort of has one or kind of has one, like a little bit, but not a lot. And so he thinks the question of animal consciousness is just it isn't a coherent question to ask, because when we discover what consciousness is, we find out that it's just a kind of a meaningless question. Do these animals have this or not? It's sometimes it's maybe, sometimes it's kind of. So I guess I am less implied to take that route. And if a theory had the implication that animals weren't conscious, then I would wonder, whether we had good evidence for that theory. But so some people might say, look, in humans, the prefrontal cortex is importantly involved, but that doesn't mean that that's the only way that you could have a kind of higher order awareness. Maybe you could have it in this way that doesn't involve a prefrontal cortex, like in a simpler animal with a more primitive version of this inner awareness. So all of that is a long-winded way of saying that, yeah, I think that the theory first way of doing it is it runs into those kinds of difficulties where you're not clear what would confirm a theory in this case, at this instance, and that there's always going to be ways to reinterpret the evidence.
Yeah, fair enough. You mentioned also there briefly some of your thoughts on animal ethics. I was just wondering if you could maybe expand on that, and what would you say to someone who responded by saying, well, I just don't really care very much about animals, or at least some animals, and so didn't share some of your ethical views?
Yeah, so I guess I would want to know why such a person didn't care. So it may be that they just don't care about morality, And that's, I guess, one reason that someone might not care about those kinds of issues. But I find it hard to interpret someone who says, well, I know that there's a lot of suffering involved in the way that we produce this product. And I also know that it could be easily avoided, and that there are ways of, if not like minimizing the suffering, then avoiding it. And yet I just don't care about. And also, I guess you'd have to add that, and also, I care about morality, and I want to do the right thing, but I just don't have a considered. It doesn't really bother me in this case. So I find that to be a hard position to understand. I would want to know why they thought that they really cared about morality if they had an example of a case where there was a tremendous amount of suffering that was easily avoided, but yet they weren't motivated to do anything about it. So if someone said so maybe I'm misinterpreting the way that you meant that question, but if someone said they literally just didn't care, then I would want to know what they meant by that, because I find that hard to understand. Now, maybe what they would say is, well, I just think that humans are more important, and that animals just intrinsically matter less than humans. To which I guess this is why, people like Peter Singer has coined the term speciesist to kind of capture this idea. And I guess I would say, yeah, that sounds a bit like speciesism, just saying that yes, there's these things which are identical, namely suffering. They're the same, and I get that humans can suffer in ways that go beyond what animals can. Like we can anticipate future events and so forth. And we have higher level pleasures, and so you could you can have all that stuff. And I'm not saying that humans are equivalent to non-human animals, but at least you could find some cases of a pain. I think like you could find cases of a pain in me and a pain in, say, your typical pig, where as pains they were very similar along at least some dimension. Like obviously, I would have higher levels of discomfort because I've been wondering how long this is going to last, and is it going to happen again? So and the pig probably isn't doing stuff like that. But still, just insofar as the like the painfulness of the burn or the shock or whatever, that just in that dimension, I would think, well, these two are indistinguishable in terms of their painfulness. Now, can we verify that? I don't know. I haven't been a pig, but that was sort of what I was saying earlier about thinking this is more like a moral issue. So, you could deny that the pig felt pain and say maybe it just reacts in such a way that physiologically looks like it's suffering, but it isn't. I think that's hard to take seriously, especially given what we know about their cognitive abilities and so forth. But I don't know. There are some people who I think would maybe defend that sort of view there, but I would say, yeah. So that would one thing is that there's just this connection between like being able to reduce suffering and sort of caring about it. But also, I think that you could say there's a kind of rational motivation as well. So there's a motivation, I think, that comes from the way we feel, and also a rational motivation in that it's sort of Kantian in a sense, whereby so Kant thought you want to have this test to see whether something was moral, to see if you could will it as a universal law, and will that everybody acted in the way that you were thinking about acting. And if you couldn't consistently do that, then there was some flaw. You were in some sense being irrational. And so there's a lot of controversy about this, but some people like this kind of general Kantian idea that morality is a law that we give to ourselves, that the source of morality is just from the fact that we are kind of a law-willing kind of creature. And so, well, what could the content of that law be? Well, it can't be anything specific. So this is just general Kant 101 at this point. But so that would have to be just the form of the law in some sense, that we act in a way that we could universalize or something like that. And so a lot of times people will want to just include in who gets to be sort of thought about in this condition as just a rational agent. Certainly that's what Kant thought too. Kant had a horrible view about animals. He thought that you couldn't harm them directly. So if I like came over to your house and killed your cat, then I wouldn't have done anything wrong to the cat, according to Kant, or at least some interpretations of them. But instead, what would have happened was I would have done something wrong to you, the owner of the cat, because I would have damaged some property of yours, and therefore did something immoral with respect to you, but not with respect to the animal, because they just weren't rational, and so didn't even enter into the realm of moral consideration on this way of reading Kant. And so I think that the problem with that is that you can also sort of enter the cat into your thinking as a sentient agent, which is also one description of you. So we are sentient. And so if you sort of thought about, well, what would, if you were in that cat's position, so to speak, could you assent to this? I think you can get the same sort of inconsistency at that level as well. And so I think that, there's a lot of, and so one argument that I've heard in response to this is, look, there's a lot of things to worry about, and humans are pretty bad off in a lot of places, so we should focus our attention on them and not so much the animals. And I'm sensitive to that idea, but I just don't think that, worrying about one thing means that you can't worry about the other things as well. And I really do think that future history will look back on like factory farming as one of the great moral tragedies, with some other ones as well. But this one would be up there, I think. One of the shortcomings of people will look back and say, "Wow, we'll think about it the way we think about the tragedies of the past." I think that's an empirical prediction. So we'll see. Maybe it would happen, maybe it won't. But that's what I would predict. And yeah, so anyway, that's what I would say to someone. I would want to draw them into a discussion about what they mean by morality and why these kind of considerations don't move them. Now, having said that, just really quickly, I would also say that I recognize that being a vegan is a luxury in the sense that I can afford to do it. And certainly, I grew up in a way where that was more difficult to maintain because of our income. I grew up in a kind of poor area of Los Angeles and Central California, and so it costs money to be able to eat healthily on that kind of diet. Not everyone can do it, so I understand that this is. So that sometimes if what people say is, well, look, if you ought to do something, that means you can do it. So this ought implies can. Then I think that maybe some people don't have the obligation to live in this way because they can't afford it, or they can't and otherwise actually pull it off. So I think that the issue is complicated. And that's partially because of societal reasons, and the way it's cheaper to buy a Big Mac than it is to buy some healthy food that you can cook for yourself that's whole grain or organic or whatever. And that's unfortunately the way our society is, and we should be working to change that. But so I do think that that you can't just make a blatant statement like you should be vegan or you should be vegetarian, because there may be other considerations which render it sort of out of their ability, so to speak. They just may not be able to do it for financial, societal, cultural, or whatever reasons. I'm a little bit more skeptical about biological reasons, although I have heard people try to make the argument that there's some things we can only get from meat, and some people have said, well, I just wasn't healthy unless I was eating this way. So I don't know. To be honest, I'm not too much of an expert on that science. But I would be surprised if those things were true.
All right, thanks for that answer. So we're going to get to a few VC questions. So David Lee Roth, if you wanted to ask your question again.
Hi, Dr. Brown. Thanks so much for being here once again. I actually have a couple of questions. So if you're not able to keep track, that's totally fine. I'll understand. So let me start with this one. First, a lot of identity theorists I speak to personally present the case of identity theory in a sort of in a way where they, for example, point out the problems with other viewpoints, let's say other physicalist viewpoints, and say, you know what, identity theory is the most reasonable. However, if you were asked to present a positive case for identity theory, what would it be? That's my question number one. Another question I wanted to ask is, of course, how do you respond to the explanatory gap problem that was put forward, I believe, in the 70s or 80s the first time? And I actually had two more. One is, you mentioned epiphenomenalism. Sorry?
Well, just take a couple for now, but we'll and go on to.
Yeah, you mentioned epiphenomenalism, and I'm wondering, do you think that the case for epiphenomenalism is dead? Do you believe that there is no way to rescue some kind of an epiphenomenalist view? Do you foresee it making any resurgence? And similar questions about functionalism. Do you think functionalism is dead and there's nothing to rescue it, so to say? And thank you. That will be all of my questions.
Okay, cool. So I mean, I think functionalism is the dominant view right now amongst people that think about these issues. So I would be very surprised if functionalism kind of died out, just because it's extremely popular now. Of course, there's 100 million varieties of functionalism, and in psychology, that word means something different, slightly different than philosophy. So computationalism is sometimes a word you would hear over there, but so the idea basically being that there's a kind of function which can be defined into abstract terms, the implementation of which is the performance of this or that mental activity. I think that that's the dominant view, and that the identity theory is a minority view, and so are these other kinds of theories, like panpsychism and so forth. The people hold them, but I don't think they're like holding over large swathes of the professional world, at least. I mean, at least the philosophers of mind and so forth. So now the positive, kind of go back to the beginning, the positive case for the identity theory. I guess, so I really have, I'm someone who splits. I don't have like a definitive view, so I'm not trying to dodge the question or be unhelpful, but I do think that I sort of have partial credence levels in multiple positions here, and I wouldn't say that I would. So I would defend them all, is basically what I'm saying. And but anyway, so one of those views is the idea that identities they're not discovered, but they're postulated to make other explanations. So to take the example like water and H2O, why do we think that water is identical to H2O? Why don't we think that water is merely correlated with H2O, or that there's a dualist water H2O, and which is compared to the physical H2O, the way some people think dualism is true of the mind and the brain? We don't think that. In fact, I don't know of anybody who has gone around saying, dualism for water. So why don't we do that? Well, the one answer is because this isn't something we discovered about the world, but this is something we postulate about the world to make other things intelligible. So here, this is kind of the mesh kind of argument I was alluding to, but in a different context. So here we have some facts about what water does, like it freezes at a certain temperature and boils at another temperature, and various sea levels and blah, blah, blah. If you put salt in it, it boils at a higher temperature, you go to the top of the mountain, lower, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so you got the whole facts about what happens to water. And then we also have some facts about what happens to H2O. It crystallizes at this temperature. It's what we would call a liquid at another temperature. And so then these two things, we can line them up. We say, there's this correlation that exists. When the water is in this state, the H2O is all in this other state. So when the water is frozen, the H2O is crystalline in its structure. When the water is liquid, the H2O has its particles kind of freely moving about. And so we see this kind of connection. And so that's a correlation. And then what we want to know is, well, what should we do with it? Well, many times what we do is we postulate an identity. We say, well, the one thing is the other thing, because now we can explain, using this identity, we can explain why water freezes at a certain temperature. It's because water is H2O, and H2O has these chemical properties such that when the temperature is low with the kinetic energy, blah, 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 crystalline bonds, blah, 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 you tell the whole chemistry 101 story. And then now you got a way to understand why water freezes at a certain level. But the identity between water and H2O wasn't it's self-explained. It's kind of a brute thing that you postulate to give other explanations. And if that's your picture, then the reason why we would think that the brain is identical to the mind is because we would be able to explain certain kinds of things which we couldn't otherwise. And here I think, and this kind of goes right to the question about epiphenomenalism, because I think that one of the things that we're able to explain is the way that the mental causes physical events. So if I have a itch on my lip and I reach my finger over to scratch it, you might think that my experience of the itchiness played some role in causing that to occur. And so identifying the neural activity with the mental activity gives us a way to explain what happened. Well, the itchiness just was this activity in the brain, and here are the motor commands, and the arm moved in this way or so forth. And now, so that's one way of approaching these identities, and that is the way I think that people like Ned Block think about this question. And he is an identity theorist about these kinds of properties, like the phenomenal properties. He thinks that he's not a higher order theorist; he's a first order theorist, and that that's whatever. But he thinks that these things are identical with certain activities in these various brain areas. And the reason why he thinks that is because we postulate them in order to make other explanations to connect the psychological level to the neural level, so that we can understand how having these mental effects is brought about by having the physical effects. Okay, so that's one thing. I think that if you're asking for evidence for the identity theory, then somebody might respond, look, you don't give evidence for identities. They're postulated and then they're judged based on their explanatory usefulness. And here's a very useful explanatory identity. Now, of course, not everyone's going to agree with that, but that's, I think, one strategy. So another strategy is to try to deduce the identity being true. And this is the strategy that's associated with like David Chalmers and his what's sometimes also called the Canberra plan, which is this kind of revival of a picture that was had by the logical positivists, actually, which like people like Carnap and those kind of guys who thought that you could have a theoretical set of sentences which were sort of austere in a certain sense, from which every other truth could be deduced from, so that there would be this kind of core set of base truths. And for the old logical positivists, those were just like the truths of physics. So that that project would kind of, people have lost hope in it in certain ways. And so what the people like Chalmers have done is say, well, you got to add some fact to the base things, but it's still relatively narrow. Like you add some basic facts about consciousness, and then so it's still fairly a constrained set. It's not as constrained as those guys thought, but it's still not everything. And then you deduce the fact that water is H2O. So all you have are like you have the concept of water, and you have some information about how H behaves, and then it should follow like logically. It should be entailed logically from the facts about physics that water is wet and so forth. And so this is also sometimes associated with David Lewis. He was a physicalist. And so David Chalmers is a non-physicalist. So the idea here is you can have it either as a physicalist or not. And it's a separate idea from the other one, which says, you don't explain identities, they get postulated. So here's one that says, they're logically implied by a certain kind of theory. So I think you could give a version of that for consciousness being physical. You would basically have to say, well, you'd have to identify some kind of roughly, some way of picking consciousness out. And so the obvious candidate that people have most times appeal to is like a functional description of the thing. And then you say, so, conscious state X is having this functional profile. The brain state being in this state is it's doing that functional profile. Therefore, consciousness is this brain state. That's a way of kind of deducing the identity. So then the question is like, well, what would you put into the first premise? It's easy to do it for water. We say water is wet at this temperature. And so there's a bunch of facts we could put in there to help pick it out. So I don't know. I think here the higher order theory helps us in a sense, because if you really take this idea seriously, that people who are in mental states that they're not aware of in any way of being in, that those things are the unconscious states. Like if I show you something on the screen and you say, I didn't see anything, and I say, well, there was something there, and you say, well, I didn't see it. I think that is very good evidence that you just didn't have a conscious state at that point with respect to the stimulus. And so the reverse of that is that you need a kind of awareness to have the consciousness of the state. So if that's kind of an essential component to consciousness, then that gives us a way to kind of think about a way we could perform a certain kind of deduction. Consciousness involved this kind of inner awareness. Here's the brain stuff that does the inner awareness. Therefore, consciousness is that brain stuff. Now, of course, that runs into all the problems that we were talking about earlier about how you distinguish these various states at the neural level. And so I don't think you could do it now. but at least it would be some reason for thinking that the identity theory could be true. So that would be my answer to the question about positive evidence for it, because so you either have to deduce it or postulate it. And there's a third option here, which is to say, well, look, these things are all empirically equivalent. And this is something like someone like Philip Goff likes to say. So he says, materialism, dualism, panpsychism, they're all going to postulate the same physical stuff. And they're only going to differ in sort of how their metaphysical level, which is independent of the science. So I think that's a third issue. So now, it's with respect to epiphenomenalism, I don't think we can rule it out. It's certainly consistent, and there's evidence that we have these Francis Crick and Christoph Koch, they call these things zombie systems. We have these zombie systems in the brain where things are done sort of relatively automatically and don't involve any kind of conscious awareness. And so epiphenomenalism is a possibility, but I think it's a cost to have to say that that consciousness doesn't cause anything, because you have to give up a kind of common sense idea. And if you have a theory that you can explain that common sense idea, I think that's the better theory, because most of the folk psychological platitudes are platitudes because they're more than likely true, which is why they survive in folk psychology, I think. So, I don't think you can rule out epiphenomenalism on scientific grounds, because it doesn't make any empirical predictions, and you can't rule it out on logical grounds. So, I think that we can't rule it out, but I also don't think that that it would be bad to believe that it's true.
Great. I think we had another voice question from Ace, if you wanted to unmute.
Hey, Dr. Brown. I quite enjoy reading your papers, actually. You actually arguably were the one that turned me into a type C physicalist.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the thing is, so I wrote this out, so I'm just going to kind of quickly read it out. So, given the bombasticism and popularity of type A physicalist and the sad reservation and mostly ignored status of type C physicalist, so it seems that I would agree that type C physicalists, they kind of resolve and clarify many of the issues that type A physicalists have, mostly in them over assuming things and their definitions and that kind of stuff. However, the type C physicalist argument usually ends up with just a big IOU, the empirical sciences will figure it out. And to a lot of people, this kind of seems like an unsatisfactory answer. So, where at the same time you're kind of buttressing physicalists in some positions, but then saying, no, the dualists probably are at least have ground to stand here, probably more ground to stand than you assume. And so it seems like kind of a split-minded, kind of halfway position. And do you think that there might be some way to put forth maybe some more weighty arguments for type C physicalism rather than just maybe pointing out conceptual issues with type A?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So, for type, so these type A, B, C physicalisms and stuff, it sounds like if people know what that means, and maybe I'll just say sort of what they are generally.
Yeah, if you could go over them really quickly for others, yeah.
So it really depends. It's all relative to the way David Chalmers sets the problem up. So, you have this general explanatory argument that says, physics explains structure and function. Consciousness is not a structure or functional property, so physics doesn't explain it. And then you can sort of give examples, and you say, well, what do you mean? People say, well, the zombies and the inverts, and okay, so you have all these Case Mary in her room, right? You have all these thought experiments which tug at you in various ways. And so Chalmers introduces a kind of the terminology of the hard problem to kind of get at these kind of problematic cases. And maybe we're cheating a little bit by putting it this way, but this is one way of thinking about what's going on, is that consciousness doesn't seem like it's associated with a functional or structural property. because it seems like whatever those properties were, you're going to ask this coherent question. Well, but why are they associated with this conscious experience as opposed to another one? Or why, how do I know that my seeing red isn't like you're seeing yellow, even though we're behaviorally all the same? So if you really can have those kind of inverted cases, and if there really is a question about, how is it possible that you can have this this very same physical state but not have the conscious experience, then so that's the hardness of the hard problem, is exactly this idea that there doesn't seem to be a functional profile associated with consciousness. And then you can kind of give these cases as some evidence for it. So the easy problems, according to Chalmers, are the problems about how you store information, how memory works, how attention works. And so we can say, well, attention is just, amplification of a neural signal. And that's part of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, is sending signals that amplify these ones from the visual cortex. Aha, there's attention. And so that's a kind of sketch of a theory about attention and how it's controlled. But you get and it may not be right, but you get the idea that there doesn't seem to be a problem in principle there, saying how information is stored or how attention works or how memory works, until you bring in consciousness. And so that's the hard problem of consciousness. And that the ABC stuff is all categorized in response to how you feel about this hard problem. So the type A people are typically represented as saying, well, there is no hard problem. We can tell right now what consciousness is. It's just a brain process or a functional property, and there's no issue about it. Mary can know in her room what it's like to see red. And so people like Dennett are most closely associated with this type A position, although Dennett's very clever and it's all not 100% clear what his real views are. But anyway, so that's a kind of prototypical example of that. The type A people say no hard problem at all. There's all just easy problems, and they're working on the science. So the type B people say, well, look, these identities are postulated sort of after the fact. They're what Kripke called a posteriori necessities. They're things that we only found out from experience, but once we know they're true, we know that they're necessarily true. Just like water is H2O, it was something we found out from experience. And now, since water is H2O and identities are necessary, we know this is a necessary fact, but we found out about it empirically. So those are the type B people. And then there are the type C people who, as you were saying, say, well, look, the science isn't at a state right now where it can answer these questions, but in the future it may be. And so, Thomas Nagel is a kind of classic guy and who has influenced a lot of type C people. And he gave the example of like traveling back to time and meeting Socrates and trying to explain relativity physics or quantum mechanics to Socrates. And he's not a dumb guy, obviously. Socrates is a genius, probably. But he wouldn't be able to understand what you were telling him. And certainly, even if he could understand it, he wouldn't know why it was true, because he just doesn't have the right concepts. Or just like there are things that you need to understand like what's going on in relativity theory. You need to understand like non-Euclidean geometry, for example. And he doesn't have any understanding of that. So you'd be sort of wasting your time doing it. And so the idea is, well, maybe that's the position that we're in right now. Maybe the fact is that some future neuroscience will be able to answer these questions, but we can't understand how it could do so now. And that's what generates the kind of thing that you were saying. I think that this seems sort of like a wishy-washy sort of thing. And what Chalmers has done is to argue that. Yeah, I mean, so Chalmers has actually tried to argue that you, at this point, you either end up being a type A or type B in the long run, so that the same arguments apply. Like either what your position has to be, according to him, is that, in the future we'll learn that consciousness is really a functional or structural property, and then we'll be type A people, or we'll learn that we just have to postulate these identities or something like that, and then we'll be type B people. But that ultimately, either one of those options, there's no other option, he thinks, and so you're going to be one of those. And so the same arguments apply in the type C thing doesn't really work.
Yeah,
So, but
I agree that you're gonna type C people will eventually resolve into type A or type B depending on how the science goes. Yeah, that makes sense. But
okay.
I
So
was just
if you think that though,
Mhm.
then Chalmers thinks that all the same arguments apply, right? It's just they, so you'd have to deal with all the same objections, and so you can still do the arguments and everything just as well. But there are people who don't think that that's the case. So it's not clear to me that
Oh,
those are the
really?
only two options.
Hmm.
And so that's the problem here is that if you're trying to sort of imagine what a scientific, I mean, how can someone predict using the tools of ancient Greece what quantum mechanics would look like? They can't really because they can't. There's no way to picture it. Even now, obviously, the math of quantum mechanics has all kinds of interpretations and so forth. So it's not clear how science will progress. And there's a kind of optimistic meta induction, I think, that you can kind of perform here. And so you kind of look at the history of science, and what you see is a history of people coming to figure out ways in which things which previously presented as not scienceable or not subject to the study by science became so. And of course, consciousness could be special, and it may resist that, and that's
This
certainly
is kind of
possible.
and this is kind of like appealing almost a little bit to like two-dimensionalism, where we've created these conceptual frameworks that even allow us to do science about these things in the first place, where we couldn't even, where it was kind of just a conceptual endeavor, it was not an empirical endeavor before that conceptual framework.
Yeah, I think that's a good question too. Is like before the scientists can do the work, the philosophers need to do the work. They need to, of
Yeah,
course,
yeah,
some people dispute that and would say, no, you just jump in and just do the science. But I do think that, yeah, that
yeah.
you have a background theory, whether you know it or not. So I agree with what you're saying, but
So onto the weightiness issue. So you're saying, okay, so if I'm arguing physicalism versus dualism or whatever, there should be no shame in me, appealing to like type A or type B style physicalist arguments. It's just to always keep it in the back of my head that there are at least some kind of IOUs here and there. Is that what you're saying?
yeah, there are definitely IOUs here and there.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the IOUs are cashed in by this kind of meta induction over the history of science. That in general, this is a
Yeah,
trend that we've
I
seen as we get better theories. And so so some people are going to look at this debate and say, look, here's the problem is that you have one group of people who say, look, we can't give you a theory about what consciousness is. You know it if you see it. Or it's like jazz, right? It's like if you got to ask, you're never going to know. That's a famous quote from Louis Armstrong that Bloch likes to quote a lot of times when people talk about consciousness. And he says, look, if we can't say anything useful about consciousness. We just have it, and we know it when we have it. And so there are people out there who think that that's the problem is how we set it up from the starting point, because we've already assumed at that point that no theory is going to ever be revealing about the nature of consciousness, because we sort of started off saying no theory could ever reveal the nature of consciousness. So the alternative view would be, look, what we need is a good theory about what consciousness is, and then that's going to help us with some of these other questions. And notice that's different than in the animal case, which we were talking about, because there it was the theory was a theory of the implementation of consciousness. Like how does the theory that we think is correct get implemented in these other systems, and what counts as an implementation of it versus just almost but not close enough an implementation. So that's a different kind of issue. But here we're talking about getting clear about what consciousness itself is, not how it's physically implemented, but just its psychological nature, and using that as a way of trying to figure out these other questions.
Great. Well, I really appreciate you answering my question really well. And I have more questions, but I'm gonna defer to the other questions that are on the table. So thanks.
Cool.
All right. Shamos had a question where he's wondering. He said he saw a YouTube video where it appeared that you were hostile to compatibilism, about freedom, and you went as far to say that you thought the compatibilists were just changing the subject. And so he asked, this led me to believe that whatever leanings you had were probably libertarian in nature. And so maybe could you describe your views on free will and whether they've changed since then?
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I was hostile to compatibilism, and I still am. I think hostile to compatibilism. Although I'm going to read this new book that came out between discussion between Dan Dennett and Greg Caruso exactly on this question about compatibilism versus not libertarianism, but in a hard incompatibilism. So, I mean, just sort of personally, I've always wanted libertarianism to be true. I think that if I were like king of philosophy, then and could do anything metaphysically, I would say make libertarianism about free will true. Um, but I think also at the same time that it's very difficult to see ways in which it could be true, given what we know about physical reality. I think that maybe quantum mechanics allows for some leeway here, not because of the randomness, but I think that because if you could make the case that consciousness played some role in collapsing the wave function, then you could maybe also make the case that what we perceive as random outcomes are actually somehow determined by the non-physical self that interacts with the quantum waveform. Of course, that's already way far outside of my physicalism, but it's a kind of view which libertarian free will could exist and is compatible with what we know about physics. And so I think that we don't know for sure that libertarianism is false. But it's not doing it. You have to work really hard to see how it could be true. And so I like accounts about like, we have certain moments where we have character defining choices and all those sorts of things I think are worth exploring, but I think that it's not clear that they win out at the end of the day. So in that case, then what are you supposed to say? So I do think that compatibilism redefines the concepts about what we mean by free will. And I think that one of the things that I'm seeing maybe in the more recent discussion from Dennett, the one I was just mentioning, this I'm even forgetting when the name of the book is, but they just came out with Greg Caruso. Anyway, I think one of the things that he is more explicit about is that this is what's called conceptual engineering, that we want to take a concept which used to be used in a certain way and repurpose it to be used in this more meaningful way, this compatibilist way. And so there, I think a lot of the objections which were referred to when I was arguing with Greg actually earlier were to this idea that an older compatibilist idea, which traces back to people like Hume, which says that, look, all we've ever meant by the words free will is the stuff that compatibilists say, and that nobody except philosophers have ever meant anything like libertarian free will and so forth, and that it's a total made up philosophical category. That always seemed crazy to me, because I mean, before I studied philosophy, I like to think I was somewhat of a regular person, at least for some period of time. And I just thought these issues were obvious, that there was a kind of libertarian free will. So I always found the idea that, look, that you made this up because you thought about these weird cases to be very strange, because I just had these intuitions right off the bat. Like as soon as I thought about it, I was like, duh, it's libertarian free will. So a lot of my objections were to that kind of, it's a terminological dispute about what we mean by the word free will, what the word free will means. And there, I think the compatibilists are off on a bad foot. But if you switch it and you say, well, look, okay, we agree that, when people talk about freedom, they usually mean, the folk psychological notion is that something about libertarianism, then we just think that that's false, and that we want to still keep the word free to apply to this more useful thing called control, which is implemented by the physical system. I think I have a lot less of animosity towards that kind of view. And so I don't think that, so if that was your compatibilist now, so for Greg, as far as I understand Greg's view, his view is that no, that's even there, we should abandon the term. We should stop talking about free will altogether. There's no reason to redefine it. But there, I think what they're arguing about is whether we should redefine the notion. In which case, I think, yeah, that's not so bad. I guess, yeah. So I don't know if I'm answering the question, but yeah. So that my thoughts on free will have changed a little bit because of this debate that I've been seeing going on between Greg and Dan Dennett.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I think the book you're talking about is called Just Desserts: Debating Free Will.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Cool.
All right. So I think we'll move on to another text question we had from Dan P. Who was wondering whether cognitive science can shed any light on the necessary and sufficient conditions for belief. What is a belief, and whether we can determine that in cognitive science.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there's a lot of debate about what a belief is. And it's kind of, I think here, ordinary people maybe disagree slightly, because I think one of the kind of received notions in philosophical psychology anyway, is that a belief is a kind of dispositional state. It's a disposition to have certain occurrent states, which you might call like a judgment that something is the case. And I would have just called that a belief like as a mental state that someone can be in. But I think that way of using the word belief is somewhat of a minority. And the way people typically use it is as a dispositional state, like you could believe something even when you're asleep in a dreamless sleep, and so not having any occurrent mental activity. You're just like, there's all just subcortical automatic information processing going on in a deep dreamless sleep, like let's say no mental states at all, or at least not relevant to this, and you would still be counted as believing that Sacramento is the state of California, a capital California, and 2 + 2 is 4, and you would still have all these beliefs. So if that's what you mean by a belief, then there's a question about how how you have those sorts of things, and what the dispositions ultimately are going to be grounded in, and what states are the triggers of it, and so forth and so on. And but probably what was meant was like this more a mental occurrence, like when you actually like judge that something is in front of you, like there's a dog, you have a thought to the effect that there's a dog present, or it's like those sort of well, like I said, judgments. So if that was the question, how can cognitive neuroscience help us with that? That question is, of course, very difficult. Jerry Fodor, the great philosopher of psychology and mind, he's sadly dead now, but he thought that we couldn't really give an account of this sort of thing because we didn't have an account of what he called central cognition, that we could give accounts of various modules that did various jobs, like little encapsulated cognitive systems that process shape orientation, or whether something was a face, but just as kind of general reasoning ability, what counts as a thought and so forth, is going to be something that's very difficult. But even so, I think the answer is that we could make some progress on this. Of course, we would need more tools that we don't quite have right now, because like we can say, aha, the visual system is organized in this nice, what's called topographic manner, where there's a kind of pattern. And so my friend and the philosopher, cognitive neuroscience and would-be philosopher that I work with a lot, this guy Hak-Wan Lau, he likes to liken it to the difference between like a piano and a trumpet. So a piano has a nice organization whereby anywhere you hit it, you're going to make a sound, and the sound's going to be, if the piano's in tune, it's going to be a sound that's recognizable. And notes that are closer together in the scale are closer together on the keyboard, so that B is by C and so forth, in this kind of nice orderly progression. And so visual cortex is a bit like that in its organization, by which we mean like different parts of space are coded for by areas in the brain that are close together. So you like the upper left quadrant of your visual field is coded by neurons that are closer to each other than they are to neurons that code for like the center bottom right part of your visual field. And so there's a kind of map in there of the visual space, and you can kind of get at it. But the areas that are higher up in the processing chain, like in the prefrontal cortex, they're not organized in this way, and their activity is a lot more. It's not as linearly correlated with the stimulus, and so it's harder to see what's going on and what would count as a coherent pattern or thought. So it's hard to know what to look for in the first instance. So how could cognitive neuroscience tell us what a thought is at this point? Well, we'd have to first of all figure out like what kind of activities or patterns correspond to thoughts. And there we just don't have a lot of evidence. We do a lot of like, here's a lemon or a tomato or a face. So it's a lot of picture stuff because a lot of the brain's processing power is devoted to vision. And so we've spent and we are obviously visual creatures. So we spent a lot of time studying that. But what the neural correlates of a thought are much less well understood. And some people might even think that really they're not the sorts of things you want to look for in the brain. And so this is like sometimes I can almost get myself into the mode of thinking, yeah, something like this is true, but other times I'm not sure. But so the picture here is that that thoughts are kind of postulated as theoretical entities, sort of like electrons in physical science. So no one's ever directly observed an electron, but what we observe instead are sort of things that are explainable in terms of there being something like an electron around, like a vapor trail in the cloud chamber. It looks like something just moved through there, so we'll call that thing whatever it is, an electron. And there are various properties, effects that we observe, which can be explained if we postulated the existence of this thing with a negative charge, call it an electron. And so some people think that the kind of folk psychological theoretical stuff that I was talking about earlier is kind of a theory of the mind, which postulates these entities called beliefs and desires and seeings and so forth and so on. That those things are theoretical postulates of a particular kind of theory. And then there's a question about like, well, all right, so are those things psychologically that we postulate real in the neural stuff? And there, I think you can always find interpretations of the stuff that's going on at the neural level, which says, yes, it's an implementation of this or that kind of psychological theory. So I think it's very difficult to get like a one-to-one correspondence about, okay, so I have this, so just to give you an account. So here's two different theories about like how thought-like things would come about. So one is the language of thought hypothesis postulated by someone like Jerry Fodor. And he says, whenever you have a thought like Fido is a dog, you actually token in your mind a little sentence-like thing. It's not in English or Spanish. It's in something called mentalese, but it's got parts that you might call concepts. And concepts are sort of like words. And it's got an overall syntactic structure, and that the brain is sensitive to its your psychology in general is sensitive to its syntactic structure. And so what we call thinking is really a series of computations performed on the syntactic structure of these language thought-like representations. And they have various other properties like compositionality and recursiveness and these other sort of linguistic seeming properties. And so we postulate the existence of this language of thought, which has this kind of structure that you build it up from its simpler parts. So when you think that dogs bark, the same thing is occurring as when you think dogs are brown. So the pit that picks out dogs, the concept of dogs is the same in both cases because it's like a mental word. So that's one picture. Whereas on another picture, what you do is you say, look, you don't start with kind of concept-sized things, you start with sentence-sized things. And so you have full-blown sentences, and you can kind of define the meaning of these sentences in terms of the inferential relations that hold between them that a subject is going to be disposed to make. Like from the fact that something is dog, you'll infer that it barks and that it's got a tail and, so various things of that nature. And so these are two different pictures. One saying you start with these concept-side things and build up sentences. The other saying you start with sentences and their inferential relations kind of in a holistic fashion. And so people are still arguing about that. One is kind of associated with someone like Quine. That's the inferentialist picture. And the other one's associated with someone like Jerry Fodor. And that's the kind of what's called an animist picture sometimes. And the people debate this. So it's not clear what the right answer is. I have my feelings about it. And I think these certain arguments are successful and others aren't, but that's not the point. The point is that if you want to know what cognitive science can tell us about what a thought is, well, first we got to say what a thought is, and then how it would be implemented in the brain. And we're still arguing about that first thing about what a thought is, in a way that's much more intractable than like what, I mean, in my opinion anyway, what consciousness is, because we have a kind of grasp on consciousness from the first person. And so anyway, so yeah, I think it's difficult. Now, you can still, ask people to think thoughts and encode the activity that, goes on in their brain. And to some extent, we've been making progress on that decoding question. But I think that's much like the idea about when would cognitive neuroscience tell us about thoughts, I think is very far off. And it's not even clear what kind of evidence we'd look for in the brain. I mean, to make any of these things empirically testable, you have to propose a hypothesis about where in the brain, what kind of activity would you associate with these sorts of structures that we're postulating. And I don't think we're anywhere near being able to do that at this point.
You bring up a lot of very interesting and complex issues. I just had a sort of follow-up question. On whether things like beliefs and other intentional states or and so forth are merely some sort of theoretical posit. It's like unobserved in the way that electrons are, as you mentioned. Something about that seems, at least to me, very implausible, in that, well, can't we just introspect and reflect on certain intentional states that we have? So my thinking of in this way, I'm calling that sort of thought a belief and so on. And it's not merely a theoretical posit. I'm introspecting it in a sense, observing it in that way. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I think that there's a danger here of making the circle too small, because we can introspect only conscious thoughts. And so if there were unconscious thoughts, then introspection wouldn't tell us anything about those because they're unconscious. And so there's a question, which, are there any such states which are unconscious? And some people want to say no, that these states which are not conscious shouldn't be counted as thoughts, because, and then they'll give various reasons why that case might be. From my point of view, that seems sort of like a mistake, because if you really think that there's a thought which could be conscious at one time and unconscious at another time, well then, I mean, how do you make sense of the fact that it's an unconscious thought? You have to say, no, when it's conscious is a thought, and then when it's unconscious, it's some other kind of state that we don't really want to call with, like having that kind of mental attitude and content or whatever your story may be. So I think that there's still going to be a question, though, about whether those states exist. Those states which are not conscious but have this kind of content and play certain roles in explaining behaviors and so forth and so on. Like you may come home and your friend or someone may see you stomping around the house, and they say, why are you so angry? And you're like, what? I'm not angry. What the hell are you talking about? And they're like, well, look, because you're clearly on. And you might suddenly realize, oh, whoa, yeah, I guess I'm more mad about whatever happens on the way over here, or reading this, Wittgenstein paper or book or whatever. It's got me pissed off. You may not even realize it, and your friend may at that point point it out. I'm not saying that happens all the time or even that it's typical, but I think we've had experiences like that where somebody else is like, what's your problem? And you're like, I don't have a problem. Oh, wait, yeah, I guess I am on edge a little bit. So in those kinds of cases, introspection is not going to help us answer the question. So that's one thing I would say, is that you don't want to just rely on introspection, because the question just comes up about all these other things. And if introspection is your only way of answering it, then you're not going to have a way to answer those kind of questions. On the other hand, I also think that introspection has some explaining to do, in that it doesn't always seem to be it's not immune from error. People have argued about whether certain kinds of introspective judgments are immune from error. And even there, I think there's room for debate. But so ignoring those sorts of things, there does seem to be cases where we make errors. And a lot of these cases come from the kind of social psychology literature. So one famous case is, if you give people a choice between like 3 pairs of socks that are all identical socks from just different packages, and you just line them up and say, pick one of these pairs of socks, then people have a tendency to pick the pair of socks on the right hand side. of where they are. But if you ask them why they did that, then they start telling you things like, oh, well, this just looks cleaner, or this pair of socks just seems like it's better made, higher quality material, and so forth. But they're all identical socks from the same company, just 3 identical packages. So there's a case where it seems like people aren't really good at knowing why they did the things that they did, and so they make up this kind of story about why they did it. There are other kinds of reasons for being skeptical as well. So one of these reasons is that, so the philosopher Eric Switchgebel has made a lot about this, but in the 50s, people used to report that their dreams were in black and white and not in color, and then this changed at some point. People now typically report dreaming in color. And so there's a question about what happened? And the big obvious thing is that in the old days, all images that people saw were in black and white. So TV was black and white, print ads were black and white, and so the kind of media that people were exposed to was all black and white. And then once color television became sort of widespread, people report having dreams in color. So now, what do we say about this? Well, what Eric likes to draw from this is, well, it's not clear that people were really introspecting the content of their dreams accurately. Maybe they just have these vague impressions, and then you can interpret it one way or the other. So introspection doesn't seem like it's completely reliable in those kinds of cases. And generally, I think that the existence of all of these philosophical puzzles about conscious experience generally support this idea. So take, for example, the case of change blindness, which I mentioned briefly earlier. So in change blindness, you're like, one typical way of doing it is you're presented 2 pictures, one after the other, and there's something which is changing in the 2 pictures. Like a very famous example is there's a picture of a jet airplane, and the jet engine of the airplane is in one of the pictures and not in the other picture. And it's sort of right in the center of the picture. So it's kind of blinking. It's there, it's not there, it's there, it's not there. And even so, people are, because of the way there's a brief space between the 2 pictures being shown, and as a result, people are very bad at detecting the change, and they look at the picture for a long time and they just don't. They say, nothing's, I can't see it. So there's a question there about whether they are accurate. So did they see it or not? So one view has it that they did experience the picture, both pictures, and all of the detail. So one picture had the airplane engine present, and the other picture had the engine absent. And so one side says, yes, they experienced that change, but they weren't able to report it because their attention never landed on it. And so, the mechanisms in the brain that allow them to access it and report about it were not engaged, but they had the conscious experience. And then the other camp says, no, they only had the conscious experience of what they tell you they saw. So if they say they didn't see the airplane changing, then they just didn't experience it. They may have had unconscious representations, information about the thing which is changing may have been in their brain/mind, so to speak, but consciously they didn't experience it. And so, both of those views are compatible with what we know at this point. And introspection doesn't tell us, can't solve this problem. There's no way to know on the basis of introspection alone, because that's just what it appears like from introspection. So I think that there's enough room for skepticism here to think, well, okay, so is it the case that we're really finding what we think we're finding? And then another reason for being somewhat worried here is that you might worry that there's a kind of theory ladenness in introspection. So if you really interpret the mind as being a certain way, do you end up finding it simply because that's the way what you started out looking for? And if that's the case, we may be, thinking that we're finding thoughts and so forth and so on. And we may say, so this is sort of what the churchlings like to famously say back in the old days. They said, so they're eliminativists, and they say there's no such thing as a thought. And people got all, like, what the F are you talking about? And what they really meant was, well, I don't know if it's but what they ended up saying as a way of clarifying their position was, look, what we meant was, you're not going to find anything in the brain that looks like the way you think thoughts work, little sentences that have these syntactic parts, and what you're going to find are vector spaces and things like that. And so what's the way we think about thoughts just aren't at that level something that we're going to end up postulating in our science. They're not going to be a kind of reduction of finding out what they really are. And then so you might say, but look, I introspect the thoughts, and I think their response is, yeah, okay, so you have some kind of experience, but what is his ultimate nature? There's nothing in the brain that corresponds to it. So you sort of think about how you're using that terminology. So anyway, so I know that's not really a concise answer to the question. Well, I know I have this introspective access to these thoughts because it may be theory laden, so you're postulating these as theoretical elements, and then you find those things. It's also the case that introspection is quite misleading, and so it's not clear that we really should put that amount of trust into it to say, well, look, I know that about these things in there. And so anyway, so yeah, that's.
No, that was very helpful.
But at the same time, though, let me just say though that I am somewhat sympathetic to that, because I think that there is a phenomenology of thought. I think thoughts are conscious in the phenomenal sense, and so I do think that insofar as what we introspect is our phenomenally conscious states, I think that we can find that we have these various thoughts. So I'm somewhat sympathetic to the general idea, but so that's why I was saying. Well, I guess that the idea here is that it's not obvious that this solves all those problems. Therefore, since we have these unresolved, and there's other issues as well that introspection doesn't resolve, like for instance, whether representationalism about perception is true. So there just seems to be a lot of issues that introspectionism is kind of silent on. And so saying, well, I introspect thoughts at one level seems harmless, but if you really want to say, well, what is it that you are introspecting, and does something like that exist in the mind? Then I think that it opens up all these kind of questions that we were talking about.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's very helpful. I think we had a couple of questions related to Chalmers and conceivability arguments, and so Haiku was wondering what your response to the conceivability arguments against physicalism are.
So it's funny because I went through to grad school and I never had to deal with conceivability arguments against physicalism except from Descartes. And so I thought these were kind of a historical curiosity. And when I graduated, I got into this argument with somebody who was a big defender of the kind of Chalmers approach to mine. And I was like, wow, I didn't really know that people still took those things. And I'm not trying to be mean or snide. I'm just like really the kind of stuff I studied was more empirically focused, and that's where my interests were. And so I didn't really deal with this stuff. And then afterwards, I had to go and read all the Chalmers stuff. And now I know Dave actually, and he's a nice guy and smart guy, obviously. But my basic problem always with the conceivability arguments was that I just didn't feel like we knew that zombies were conceivable. And so I thought that the argument should be weakened to something like, well, it seems to a person that zombies are conceivable. And so then so far the conclusion would be, well, it seems seemingly to you, physicalism is false. So I always thought that it was more of a test for like what you antecedently already thought about the question at hand. It was a way of sort of figuring out what your prior beliefs were. Like you think about these cases and you're like, okay, so I guess I'm inclined to think this. So that's a fact about me. And that leaves it open whether these things are actually true or false in reality, where physicalism is true or false. And so, but then I started meeting people say, no, these conceivable arguments, they don't just tell you something about what you believe, but they actually tell you that physicalism is really, really false. And so that I thought was just it's too far. And so as a way to try to illustrate why it doesn't get you what you want, I came up with what I call reverse thought experiments, which were to do it in the opposite direction. So, you have the zombie argument. The zombie says zombies are conceivable. There's no logical contradiction in there being a world that's just like ours physically, but no consciousness. And then the second premise says, well, if that's conceivable, then physicalism, then they're possible. Sorry, there's a step that links the conceivability to it being possible. And then the final thing is, well, if it's possible, then physicalism is false. So I thought, well, you could do the exact same thing from the other direction. And so I invented these things that I called zombies, which are physical creatures which have consciousness and nothing non-physical. So they're just physical duplicates of me. You define them in the same way as you do with the zombie case. You say there's a possible world, and all that's there is the completed physics of our world and also consciousness. And so at that world, consciousness is just a physical thing. That seems to me to be perfectly conceivable. And I grant that that's because I am antecedently disposed to accept that physicalism is true. And so I present this case to other people, and they say, "Well, I don't think those things are conceivable." And I say, "But that's weird because I do. And the only difference between you and me is that you seem to not accept physicalism, and I do." So that these thought experiments are not really telling us at this point what's really true or not, but really are revealing things about what we think are true, our psychology. I still think that in the limit, if we knew all the physical facts, then we would be able to, one possibility is that we'd be able to deduce that one or the other of these was really the case, that zombies were conceivable or these other things called zombies. But I don't think that as of right now we can say, because, for example, if what I call zombies were not conceivable, then there would be a contradiction entailed by the mere conception of them. And yet no one has come up with such a, no one's been able to say, like, well, here's the contradiction that results in thinking that consciousness is physical. It seems perfectly conceivable that it is the case. In fact, that's what most physicalists think. And so I think it's a really strong view to come out and have to say, well, look, zombies are just not conceivable at all. But once you sort of recognize that, then I think it really shows that. So, there's no good reason for choosing between these two at this point, except for an antecedent background belief in whether consciousness was physical or not. So I ultimately think that, and I think the same is true for like water and H2O. I think that if you go back to before people discovered that water was H2O, I think they discovered that empirically. But you could imagine someone like Aristotle. Aristotle thought that water was a simple and didn't have any parts. And here comes along these guys. They say water is not a simple. It's composed of these parts. There's hydrogen and oxygen molecules bonded in a complex way. And Aristotle just says, "Oh no, that can't be right, because I can conceive of a world physically just like ours with water, but where it's not like that." Well, I think that we can see in the retrospect that that argument would have to have gone wrong, because even though Aristotle thought that he could conceive of such a world, given what we now physically know about what water is, we can see that he wasn't really conceiving of what he thought he was. He was sort of confused, and he was picturing some other scenario in his mind. He had to have been, because that scenario he described was not possible. Water was H2O, even when Aristotle talked about it. So I think we have examples that we can look back on and say, okay, so here's a case where somebody thought that something was conceivable, but empirical facts ruled it out. Things that we later found out about the way the world is showed that the thing we thought was conceivable wasn't conceivable. And there are other cases that are more mathematical too, like the Grim Reaper paradox is something that people talk about here a lot too. It's a logical paradox, which seems like you can conceive of something at the beginning, and then once you work through the reasoning of it, you see that in fact it's contradictory, self-contradictory, and so you can't really conceive of this conception. So I think we have examples of that happening to us, where something seems really perfectly vivid to us as a way the world might be, and then finding out something else about the world. In this case, that water is H2O, finding that out. And you could go either route, right? Either this was postulated or it was implied by these background theories. Either way, we now think of it as true, and it changes what we see as being conceivable. And so I don't think that it's a very attractive position to say that, well, it changes what actually was conceivable. It just reveals that, there's some epistemic limits here, that what we find conceivable is limited by how the world really is. Like, what's possible is constrained in some sense by the way physical reality itself is. And so consciousness is going to be like that, I think. It may be the case that it seems conceivable that zombies, exist, that there are zombies, but that it ultimately turns out that it's not, and that we may realize that because of empirical things we come to believe empirically. Even so, once we realize that, just like we can now like perhaps deduce that water is H2O, even so, to find out water was H2O was something that was empirically done and had to wait for the science to come in. And so I think we're sort of at that point right now where there are these theories of consciousness, and we don't really know exactly how to test them. And this is coming up in some of our earlier discussion that we had previously on, just now, whereby it's like we have all these theories and we're not really sure what the right theory. We needed something like what Nagel called objective phenomenology, something that characterizes structure of the mind. In objective terms, we don't have anything like that right now. So we don't know how the brain functions. And so we're really at a kind of guesswork. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't do science and there are questions that we can answer and that there isn't, a reasonable case being made about this or that, the other thing. But it's just to say that these are really early days and we still don't really even have on either side of the equation nailed down the thing it is, the questions we're asking, or what would count as answers to the questions that we're asking. And so that to me suggests that we should be cautiously, cautious that we shouldn't jump in and say, well, look, we know this and that, and this argument and that. So yeah, there's things we can say, but I think it's a mess right now, and that's just unfortunately the way that it works. So that's my response to those kind of conceptual conceivability arguments. Is simply to say, well, my things are conceivable too, and only one of the other of the two is really conceivable, but we don't know which one. And for every like pounding of the table that you can do about how zombies are the conceivable one, I can pound the table about how zombies are the conceivable one, because it really does seem to me to be perfectly coherent that there's a world where consciousness is physical, and that's because my background commitments are towards physicalism, so that even if this is kind of my general issue with like this whole deduction from a base set of facts, like I'm sometimes attracted to that way of thinking about reality, but I think that a lot of what matters gets front loaded in under the kind of concepts you put into the base. And so if consciousness is a simple that you can't say anything about, then that's one set of facts you're going to get some entailments. If, however, consciousness is something that's analyzable in terms of higher order awareness, then you're going to get different things. So I really think that we're not at a point where we can nail down the options. That's why what I've said is that I think a philosophy is kind of like cartography of conceptual space, that what we're interested in is like, what we have is a lot of conditional knowledge. Like, oh, if you start here, then you can reason your way down over here. And so knowing those paths through the conceptual space is interesting and important. It's not just a waste of time to map those things, but I really don't think we're in a position at this point to definitively say how that map, like which one of those possible starting points is the one we should be starting at. With the exception of like consciousness is real. I think that's like a pretty grounded one. I'm not an illusionist or anything like that, but so I think it's we're in a position right now where that's why when I've written about this, I said what we should do is deprioritize the a priori arguments. It's not like we should get rid of them, but like with the way the government has deprioritized marijuana offenses, it's like, yeah, they're still illegal, but they're not going to enforce it. So that was my idea about deprioritizing the a priori arguments. Is like what you want to do is like recognize that, yeah, in principle you can make all these interesting a priori arguments, but it really depends on having a lot more of the empirical stuff nailed down to be able to see which of these like a priori conditionals the antecedent is fulfilled in, like which one we say if this then that, this part, which picking out our actual world. I think we're a long way away if we can't even like characterize what an inference is or how thoughts will look like. I still think that we're at the stage where there's a lot more theorizing that needs to be done.
Great. It seems to me that one of the sort of central issues in those sorts of arguments is, well, what conceivability is and what follows from it. And in your response at one point, it seemed like you were suggesting that something's conceivable when we can consider the concept and there's no contradiction entailed by it.
Yeah.
Is that the notion you of course Chalmers has a bunch of different notions of conceivability, you're probably aware. Is that the sort of conception, no pun intended, that you're using here? Or
yeah, I think so. that's what sometimes we'll call negative conceivability. That's the Chalmers lingo. So it's just not seeing any contradiction entailed by it. I think that's the most basic notion of what we mean by conceivability. And then there's the more demanding notion where you're able to picture how it could be true, like envision the scenario. I think that's a more demanding notion. And it's harder to apply here because if your claim is that like some science that we can't understand right now is going to help us understand consciousness, and then you say, well, yeah, we'll picture it, explain it to me. You're like, well, like it's not, we can't understand it. It's like getting Socrates demanding to know about this quantum mechanics stuff. And you're like, well, so there's a wave function. It's about probabilities. Like already you've lost them. So I think that we may be in that kind of situation, but that's not like a leap of faith, so to speak, to think that this may work out, because the history of science suggests that problems like this tend to get worked out. Now, of course, the argument on the other side is always, but consciousness is super special and unlike any of that stuff. And maybe that's true, in which case, yeah, it's not ever going to get worked out. But I think that at this point, just saying that consciousness is special, as opposed to it seems special, that we can't really differentiate those two. So my money would be on science working this out. And that's why I think type C physicalism is reasonable. Because this history of science suggests that every time so far that there was something that seemed recalcitrant to science eventually got explained in the normal typical ways. And you can see all sorts of examples where things that people thought, oh, well, you'll just never be able to give an account of that. I think the most famous example is like Descartes. Descartes says, well, you'll never get a machine that could understand language. And now, we're all telling Siri, hey, you over there, what's the weather like tomorrow? And she goes, blah, blah, or it, or whatever. It rattles off something about the weather. Clearly, there's some sense in which it understood what you asked, that it was about the weather, about tomorrow, and your location, etc. Now, did it really understand it in some deeper sense? I think that we could have a discussion about that, but that's it, but anyway, so the point is that Descartes didn't even think you get to the point we're at right now, where it could recognize and generate. I mean, his point was really that no machine could ever generate a response which made sense in the context. And that's just false, right? We've demonstrated that you can do this, maybe not perfectly, but certainly more than Descartes thought. So now, does that, that's a case where here's something that someone said, look, you'll never be able to understand in mechanical terms how this works. And now we have all sorts of theories. I mean, there's, plenty of theories in the philosophy of linguistics and about what these structures are. And there's, you take Chomsky and you're reading about C command, and there's all this structure that they postulate. So we've just been cranking it away, and it hasn't explained all of language, obviously, but it has made some progress, and we do understand some things about how language functions. So there's a case where science, it's not at the end, and I don't even know if being at the end of science makes sense, but in the sense that it does, we are closer to it than we were before, in recognizing how you could build a system that responded meaningfully to speech and generated speech on its own. And if you don't know about GPT-3, you should go and check GPT-3 out, because it's just amazing how good it is at responding to, typed commands, but still very good at it. And it's the source now for something called AI Dungeon. What used to be free, but now they charge for it. It's too bad. But if you haven't checked out AI Dungeon, you should. It's basically a Zork-like game made up by this artificial intelligence. And you can get it to do basically anything, and it comes with all sorts of interesting things. Anyway, so the point here is that, yes, we're in a position where I think that we don't really understand even the questions that we should be asking in large point. But it's still not a leap of faith to say I think empirical science is going to be the way to answer these questions, because of the history of it, and it's showing us that over time and again, we have been able to operationalize something we thought was unoperationalizable and make progress empirically in a way that wasn't available to us before. So then if you say, well, how can we do that? Then all I can give you are past examples, because by definition, obviously, we're thinking of some way we haven't thought of yet. So I'm certainly not a genius who's going to come up with these new scientific methods, but we've seen over and over in the history of science this happen. And so I think it's reasonable to think that'll happen in the case of consciousness as well. Even though I think we can also say that we're not anywhere close to that.
Great. So a follow up on the conceivability thing. You seem to also suggest that at most one of those views about which things are conceivable, i.e., zombies or zombies or whatever else, only at most one of those is really conceivable. But couldn't it just be that both are conceivable, given on the notion of conceivability that you have?
Yeah.
And that neither can entail a contradiction. In the same way that I could conceive of water not being H2O, I don't think there's some contradiction entailed by that from the concept.
So if what you mean by conceivability is doesn't entail a contradiction, then I don't think you can say that both of these are conceivable at the same time. Because so the zombie world is defined as a world which is physically identical to ours and which there is no consciousness. So everything is the same at the zombie world. You act the same, you think, well, I don't know if so people debate, can you have thoughts? But anyway, so all the physical stuff going on in your brain is the same and all your movements in the world are the same. And your fundamental constituents, your quarks and so forth, are the same. So you're literally identical in that sense. And yet they claim there's no consciousness there. Now, the Shambi world is the same world, but where there is consciousness. It's a physically identical world. You're down to the fundamental elements the same. So it doesn't seem like if you're picking out, if you're looking at like the modal landscape, this landscape of all possible worlds, then we are talking about the same world. There either is consciousness there, or there isn't at that world. And so the zombie people are saying at that world there is no consciousness. And I am saying no, at that world there is consciousness, but not like that doesn't mean we lack it. I mean, it's like they really have consciousness. You can't really conceive of a zombie. You think you are, but you're going wrong somehow. So in that way, it can't be and not be true of that world that there is consciousness. If everything is the same, then everything is the same. If consciousness is a physical property, then it's the same there too, because it's physical. If it's not a physical property, then it's not there. So I don't really think that you can say, if that's the way. Now you may have some other way of thinking about like how you divide up the modal landscape or something like that, in which case I would want to hear like what you're thinking about. But in that way, it's not the same. It's just the same as saying, look, is there a world where water is H2O and a world where water is not H2O? Well, if what you mean by water is the stuff that's around here right now, then there is no world where there is water and also not H2O, because water around here is H2O. So if I just grab a sample of some stuff from the lake and say, can this right here, this stuff in my hand, not be H2O? I think the answer is no, it's impossible. It's got to be H2O, because is what's in your hand is H2O. It's identical to itself. So everywhere you have that stuff, you're going to have H2O. Now you could imagine, what you can imagine is something else, which is something which is indistinguishable from that experientially, but which isn't H2O. So that's like, twin earth and twin water. It looks just like water, it falls from the sky, it's made of XYZ. So is that really water? Well, I think the question is largely verbal, about, I think in a sense it is water, in a sense it's not. But in the sense that matters for like this cup of stuff that I have in my hand, it's not water, because this cup of stuff in my hand is H2O. And so wherever this cup of water is, there will be H2O there too. And I think that's, it's hard to see what the argument against that view would be. That doesn't mean that there isn't one. There probably is, but that's what I'm thinking about in terms of conceivability and conceptual stuff. So that one of these has got to be the way this world really is, and the other one must be mistaken. I must be, according to them, wrong that this world is a world that has consciousness in it. I must be somehow, thinking of it in the wrong way. Whereas I think, no, they've got to be wrong, thinking that consciousness is missing. Either they're misdescribing the world is subtly, physically not indistinguishable from ours in some way, which makes consciousness disappear, but at a high level, you sort of gloss over. Like, for example, I've tried to argue that if Chalmers says that the consciousness depends on it collapsing the wave function, then it would be a physical property, because at worlds where there is no consciousness, you would still have the same physics, which means that there still be these same collapses of the wave function, but there's no consciousness there. So suddenly it looks like it's not the same world. So there's a question: is it or is it not the same world? If consciousness is playing this role. But anyway, so that's how I would respond to that sort of idea, is that, well, if you want to say, look, these are both conceivable because contradictions, just like I could conceive that I'm 9 foot tall, and I could also conceive that I'm not 9 foot tall. I think it's somewhat different than those kinds of cases, anyways, what I was trying to say. Yeah.
All right. Just sort of follow up on that. Isn't there a difference between saying that A is conceivable and B is conceivable, and there's a difference between that and saying that the conjunction A and B is conceivable? Because after all, that it may be false that I can conceive of myself as being 9 feet tall and not 9 feet tall, but still true that I can conceive of myself as being 9 feet tall, and true that I can conceive of myself as not being 9 feet tall. Does that make any sense?
No, it does. No, I think that's exactly right. But I'm not sure how. So are you suggesting that the Shambi zombie thing is like you being 9 feet tall in that respect, that you can conceive of them both, but not at the same time?
Yeah. So I when you started talking about conceiving of a particular world, maybe I wasn't quite following, but it seemed to me that this might be relevant there, right? Since I can conceive of a world, it seems to me at least, in the notion, in the way you're using conceivability, as being a physical duplicate of this world, but without consciousness. And at the same time, it seems to me, conceive of a world that's a physical duplicate of this world, that includes consciousness. But even if our world is one that might be a duplicate of one of those worlds, and so the other world isn't the actual world, it seems that both of those worlds are conceivable.
Yeah. So, but that's what I was saying, was that they both those worlds seem conceivable. But if they're both being conceivable leads to a contradiction, then they both can't really be conceivable. So I grant that it seems that way, like they both seem to me to be conceivable, because I've met people who say they can do both. So clearly, just taking that at face value, people say they can conceive both of these situations. Like Chalmers sometimes says, "Oh, it's harder to see how the Shambis it's harder to conceive." And anyway, I say his is harder to conceive in that case. But so we can argue about that. But I think you're right. Yes, people say both of these things are conceivable. But so it's a bit like let's take Superman and Clark Kent, although. This is a dated example. I haven't watched the Snyder cut of the Justice League, but I'm going to later. So then maybe I'll come back with better examples. But so some people say, well, look, can you conceive that Superman and Clark Kent are really distinct individuals and they're not identical? So some people say, well, yeah, of course, I can imagine a world where Superman and Clark Kent are two different people. And, Superman is still from Krypton and his parents are Jor-El, but this is guy Clark Kent and he's this, his parents are these guys. And so I can conceive of that world. And then but is that really what you're conceiving? Like you're conceiving of this. So you take this guy, I mean, Superman's a fictional character, so that's why it's not a great example, but take, a real life person like Marilyn Monroe. And what was her, Norma Jean, was that her non-stage name? So someone might not know that Norma Jean is identical with Marilyn Monroe, and so they may say, "Look, I can conceive of these two people. One is this Norma Jean person, one is this Marilyn Monroe person." But if you take the person and say, "Look, this is just one person. Is it really conceivable that this person not be this person?" No, I can conceive that this person is called, Doug or called Angela, and not Marilyn Monroe or Norma Jean. But I can conceive that this person have all sorts of different properties. But there are some things that seems like it can't conceive of them coming apart, like her not being her, like this person not being the physical person that they are. Seems like, they came from a certain sperm and egg, and that's genetically what makes them the thing that they are. So, and I can track that through possible space. I can say, what could this person have, longer hair or shorter hair, or be taller or shorter, or whatever, be a singer or be an actor. So when we're talking about one thing, then we can imagine some of its non-essential properties changing, but its essential properties would have to stay the same. Like her being identical to herself is just that's so. So in other words, the scenario where we were thinking, if that's right, then the scenario where we were thinking about, Norma Jean and Marilyn Monroe being two separate individuals, we're not thinking about this person being two separate individuals. That's impossible. What we're thinking about is a different scenario where we wouldn't say it was this person who was now two people. What we would say is that there were two people playing this role or fulfilling these functions, one doing the things we associate with Marilyn Monroe and one doing the things we associate with Norma Jean, and they are distinct from each other. But that's not a world where Marilyn Monroe isn't Marilyn Monroe, if what you mean is that this person isn't this person. So when it comes to things like being H2O, that's like one of those kinds of properties. If you grab some cup of water and it really is made out of H2O, then that's sort of like being Marilyn Monroe in this example, that you're just that thing. So wherever you go, that thing's going to be there because that's what you are. If the identity really holds. So in that case, I mean, I don't know. I guess I would say that the person who thinks there's water on twin Earth, that they're talking in that way, what Chalmers sometimes called the secondary intention, in case anyone cares about the technical lingo here.
Right.
That is that there's a contradiction entailed, actually, that there's water on twin Earth, because water is this stuff. And this stuff is H2O, and there is no H2O there. Now, there's this other stuff that sort of behaves like water, and that stuff is XYZ. So now you could call that water in another sense of the meaning. I'd be happy to be a pluralist and say there's these different senses of the word here or the concept.
Right.
So I don't really care about that's the two-dimensionalism. I'm happy to accept that. But yeah, so that's what I would say about. So people who think that they're really conceiving of these things coming apart, they're meaning something subtly different than what I was just talking about. Because what I was talking about is whether you grab the thing, you say this thing right here. So if this thing is H2O or this thing is Marilyn Monroe, then we're wondering about that thing, and could it exist as being two separate things? And it just seems like, well, one thing can't be two things, and so wherever this thing is going to be one. That's as a priori as it gets, I think. But and we have axioms and logic that kind of encode that idea. For all x equal x, and if anything else is for all z, if it's identical to x, then it's just that thing. So we have these axioms that encode that information, but I think this is just kind of a bedrock thing. That's I don't really know how I could defend except by saying, look, it's just kind of contradictory to say this thing is not that thing.
Right. And there's a lot of related and complex issues there. You bring up two-dimensional semantics. I think one thing that's also going to be relevant there is going to be a sort of day Richter day rate distinction. And so, like, part of what I think of when I say that water is conceivably not H2O is, well, when I talk about water, I have some set of reference fixing descriptions or something like that, maybe some indexicals, whatever. And when I say that it's conceivable that water is not H2O, I'm saying that something like it's consistent. If X is something that satisfies that reference fixing description, it's logically consistent that X has a property of being H2O as well. And it also has it's consistent that it does not have the property being H2O. Now, of course, it's not going to be consistent that it has both those properties as well, like simultaneously, right? But neither set will be inconsistent, I think. So does that kind of make sense?
It does, but so there's a debate about like the concepts or the meanings of these words, and so a lot of times like water and H2O, a lot of times people will say, like, you have one or the other. So what you're doing is kind of like a functional, the word of the meaning is kind of its functional sense. So water means like these things, that we could characterize with these functional descriptions. And so there is that on Twitter. So there is water there. And the other person says, no, water means like this stuff around here. It doesn't mean anything functional. It means that stuff over there. And so they're going to say the opposite thing. And then there's a debate about what's the right theory of the word, the meaning of the word. And so what I was trying to say was, I think that you can have both of those. And that's the whole two-dimensional idea, basically, is to say, well, there's a sense in which there's a this stuff component, which picks out that H2O stuff. And so that on that way of thinking about it, these things are necessary. But there's also a functional description, the primary intention, which picks out just the functional thing. And so you can have, I think why not have both as aspects of the meaning of the concept of the word? And so I wouldn't disagree with you, but that's why I was saying it depends on what the question that's being asked is. It's like, so when you say these things are conceivable, I think you need to sort of nail down, well, what is it that you're talking about? Are you talking about like this stuff? If I grab a chunk of my brain and that is the pain, is it conceivable that that thing exists and there be no pain? Well, then obviously not, because that is the pain on the thinking in this way. So that it's just, it would be inconceivable saying you have that stuff there, but no pain if they're really identical. So on the other hand, you might be saying, well, look, is there something that plays this functional role, produces these reports and so forth? And then maybe the answer there is yes, but you wouldn't be talking about our pain anymore. And so I don't think that really would threaten the identity. So I think that, yeah, in one sense, what you're saying is, and that's what the two-dimensional says about the whole water H2O thing. There's a sense in which water is conceivably not H2O, if what you mean is primary intention. There's a sense in which it isn't conceivable, if what you mean is the other thing. And so we can just make sense of both of them. So I think here, what people like Chalmers are going to say is, well, there's something about consciousness which kind of forbids you from having something else which kind of does the same job but isn't it, because anything that did that job would have to be it or something like that. And that maybe even this is revealed by introspection there. I'm not sure that I would agree, but that's a whole set of other issues about whether the primary and secondary intention of consciousness can come apart, or whether there's, you can have it, but I think that you can make some inroads there by thinking about weird cases, empirically, like pain asymbolia, which is an example of a case where you have people who can tell you about a pain, but they say it doesn't hurt. Like they'll say it's a burning pain, or it's on a scale of 1 to 5. They give you a rating, but then they say like it doesn't bother me. I don't care if it stops or whatever. So there's cases where it seems like some things which we might have thought were essential to the pain, like it being a pain, means that you care about it stopping and that you hate it and it feels horrible. But here's these guys would smile at you, and they just don't seem to like be motivated to have the pain stop, and so it's not a big deal for them. But yeah, they know it's a pain. They can tell you that they know it's not burning, it's a poking and so forth. So okay, is that a case where something we thought was essentially related to pain isn't? And so does that challenge this idea that these intentions? I don't know. So there's a whole bunch of stuff there, but certainly I would agree with you that there's a sense in which water is conceivably not H2O, but that's not the sense that matters to whether water here is H2O or not. And so if the question is like, what is our world like? Then the question is about what these other things pick out.
Right. I mean, there's a lot more to talk about there, but and I think when you talk about pain asymbolia, I'm pretty sure you brought. I first saw that in one of your papers. I think the one on deprioritizing.
Oh yeah.
I think that's something you mentioned in the part of your argument. But anyway, yeah. Yeah, you've been. There's more to talk about, obviously, but I don't want to keep you too long. So I think we're gonna.
Yeah, I really should head out, but this was a lot of
wrap it up. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Appreciate the invitation.
Thank you so much for coming, Dr. Brown. We thoroughly enjoyed these 2 hours that you're so gracious to spend with us.
Thank you. No, I had a lot of fun. I appreciate the really thoughtful and interesting questions. Yeah, thanks.